What do you think stayed home tonight because of the assignment? It's kind of like when you say there's going to be a test, this day when you're in school and you made sure you were sick that day and have to take the test. Sometimes it feels like that whenever you delve into some of these things. If you were here last week, you know that we're basically covering questions 7 through 10 on our handout on last week. That's lesson number 10, Jacob and all his family goes to Egypt. And it really involves the idea of why the Bible mentions different numbers in different places of people going down into Egypt. And I think I made mention of this back last week. This is one of those things that atheists, those who are higher up are probably not going to bother me and you too much, but to a person who's not well rooted in the faith and not developed yet and had enough Bible study, this can be one of those things where you scratch your head and you walk off going, well, I guess that's a contradiction in the Bible. And if the Bible is not supposed to have contradictions and it does, then I guess it must not be true. And so it's an important study, but at the same time, I know I say this a lot, but I genuinely mean it. I'm blessed beyond the ordinary person to be able to study God's Word like I do. I'm blessed because you guys support me so that I can do that. And a preacher is going to have, just because of the nature of his work, he's going to have more resources. He's going to have access to more resources than what I would consider just the average everyday Christian would. And not a lot of people are going to have the resources that a preacher usually has at his disposal, but that's like with any job, right? Whatever job you do, you usually have the tools of the trade to help you do that job. Not everybody has. But I think that's important when we study tonight. And I say this a lot of times whenever we look at things that I would at least label as a little deeper than the page, than what we would ordinarily do. Sometimes, and I suppose this is how is going to go, because usually when you do a study like this, this is how it goes. Some people walk out and they say, man, I understood that. And then other people walk out and they say, I'm sorry, I tried to follow you. I just couldn't keep up, or, couldn't understand where you were trying to go. And don't be discouraged by that. I always say about some of these deep studies, you're not going to get them the first time you look at them. You'll pick up bits and pieces, but you're going to have to study these things again. I guarantee you the next time that you study it, you'll probably remember something from the first time and say, oh, okay, add a little bit, to the puzzle. And pretty soon you'll have it all ironed out. But don't be discouraged when we study these things if you don't fully grasp. Humans trying to explain this is not the best way to do it, because sometimes you can know exactly what you want to say in your mind, but actually conveying that same message is a lot more difficult to do. So what I did a couple of things to try to help as much everybody understand it as much as possible. The first thing I did is I gave you a handout. I actually had that handout last week, didn't pass it out because decided we're going to put that off and cover it this week. So I'm going to change it just a little bit, but it's kind of a study basis. It gives you something to go off of and, kind of an idea that you can follow. And then the second thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to try to do it through PowerPoint too to help, so you don't have to flip back and forth and think about all these things, but to kind of help maybe develop the idea a little bit clearer. So one of the most difficult things for me, I think, to finally grasp whenever you start looking at Genesis chapter 46 is the list of all the people that's given there. And I passed that list out last week. You counted all those names up. How many names did you get there? Anybody count them up? Okay, it says 70. Okay, if you add Dinah into the picture, you have 71, don't you? And that's an important piece of the puzzle. there's a few key names I think that you have to remember whenever you're talking about these numbers. And a lot of the others you can just forget about because you'll probably not need to remember or talk about them again. But one of the hardest thing for me to come to grasp with is when you read those 70 names or 71 that are listed there, that's not the list of all the people who went down into Egypt. Okay, it's a list that you can work with. But it's not like God said, here are 70 people that went down to Egypt, here are their names. And what you'll find is, it's pretty neat comparison, but if you look at Genesis 46 and verse 8, it seems like God has given us all the names of these people, right? These are the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt. But there's kind of a shift in the narrative, if you notice there, because the first thing that he says is, well, Jacob and his sons. And then you had the sons of Jacob's sons, or in other words, Jacob's grandsons. And I found a passage, I was looking today, and I don't know why I never put these two together, but I came across this in Exodus chapter 1 and verses 1 through 5. And I want you to notice the similarity here, okay? You see that phrase, these are the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt? If you look in Exodus chapter 1, what you'll find are the 12 names of Jacob's sons. And so what I'm trying to say is this. I think in Genesis chapter 46, when he says, these are the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt, well, I know this whole list isn't it, because some of those people didn't go into Egypt, did they? We'll talk about that a little bit as we go on. But another word for Jacob is what or who? Israel. Who were the children of Israel that went into Egypt? Well, it says right there in Exodus 1 through 5, right? Here's the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. Don't have it up here, but verse 5 says includes Joseph in that. And what you'll find as you go down through that list, you'll find those 12 names in that list, won't you? You'll find the names of the children of Israel that went down into Egypt. And so what you also find in this list is, as is mentioned in Exodus 1 there, every man in his household. So you have the 12 sons of Jacob, and then you have the household of these 12 sons kind of outlined, kind of a working list for us, but not a complete list of the 70 people who went down into Egypt. We'll talk a little bit more as we go here as to how we exactly know that. So, I think when it says here, these are the names of the children of Israel that went down into Egypt, what it's talking about mainly are the 12 sons. And then here are their families. Here's their genealogy. And what we can do is we can go back through their genealogy and we can kind of say, well, he went or she went, and, oh, well, he didn't. But it kind of gives us a working idea as we go along here. Here's what we do know. Genesis 46, 6 and 7. Who all went down with Jacob into Egypt? Who would these 70 people include? Yeah. So we learned there in verse 7 of Genesis 46, this list of people includes his sons, his children, right? And his grandchildren, his grandsons. It also includes his daughters, it says. Also includes his granddaughters within that list. And so it's a list of the descendants of Jacob's sons. Now again, not all those descendants went into the land into Egypt with Jacob, as probably you all well know, at least if you studied a little bit on it. So here's the number that we want to work with. Again, I want to go back here to Exodus 1. How many people went down into Egypt? What does Exodus 1:5 say? 70, right? So if you look again at Genesis chapter 46, and mainly verse 27, I'm going to skip over verse 26 real quick. We'll come back to it in just a moment. But what you'll find there is the souls of the house of Jacob, another way we could say it, the family of Jacob, which came into Egypt, were 70. And so you have this idea, there were 70 people from the household of Jacob, from the family of Jacob, that went down into the land of Egypt. Now, here's again what I want to emphasize and what I kind of started with. It is true, if you go through the list there in Genesis chapter 46, and you take the number of the children that these women or these descendants bore to these women through Jacob, that you'll come up with the number 7. Okay, in other words, if you look at for instance, there in verse 15, it says Leah bore to Jacob 33. Okay, so you write down that 33. You go on in verse 18. Zilpah bore to Jacob 16. So you can take that 33 and that 16 and add it together and you'll get 49. And then you read about Rachel. She bore him 14. So you can take that, add it to the 49. You come up with 63, right? And then you have Bilhah. She has 7 left. Well, you add 7 to 63. What do you come up with? 70. And a lot of people would just look at that list and say, well, that's the 70 people there that went down into Egypt, right? Well, there's one main problem, and this is what I kind of pointed out here. This is not the list in its totality. This is a working list. What do you read about there in verse 12? Yeah, there were 2 sons of Judah, right? I think, yeah, don't quote me. Sons of Judah, and Onan. They're in that list of 70 people, right? Did they go down into Egypt with Jacob? No. They died in the land of Canaan, right? I'm not going to go into the details of it, but if you want to read about how they died, you can turn back to Genesis chapter 38. And you can read about it. And so what I learned about this list, again, is this is not the list of the people who went down into Egypt. This is a genealogy. It's a working list for us to kind of look through and say, well, this guy did, this guy didn't, this girl did, this girl didn't, something like that. And so it's something that you have to look over and kind of adjust the numbers to understand exactly who it was that ends up down here in Egypt with Jacob. So again, if we can understand that part of it, I think that's kind of the key to understanding the whole thing. The list that you read about here in chapter 46 isn't the people who all went down into Egypt, because we know at least 2 of them didn't, right? Are most of them the people who went down into Egypt? Yeah, most of them are. But they're not all the people who make up this list. So we have in one verse, actually numerous verses throughout the Old Testament, the main number that you get whenever it talks about the people who went down into Egypt from Jacob's family is 7. That's kind of a pretty consistent number. Whether you're reading in Genesis or Exodus or Deuteronomy, you'll read about the same number. But a couple of things to remember here, because if you just back up one verse 27 says there were 70 people from the family of Jacob who went down into Egypt. Well, how many do you read about in verse 26 there?
66.
66. So why does one verse say there were 70 that went down into Egypt, and then in another verse it says, just the verse before it says, well, there were only 66 who went down into Egypt?
Joseph and his 2 sons are already in Egypt.
Okay, so again, we're looking at that list, and what are we saying? We're looking at all those names. We're saying we're going to have to change this list a little bit, aren't we? We already noticed there's 2 guys you can't put on the list that went down into Egypt because they died in the land of Canaan. That's and that's Onan. But here's another thing to keep in mind. When you look at the number, what's the number that's assigned to Leah? Do you remember? 33. How many sons and daughters of Leah are listed there? 34. So you have an extra name in Leah's list, right? Now again, why did they do that? Well, this isn't the list of the people who went down into Egypt. This is the genealogy. You got to kind of look through it and say, well, who went and who didn't. But here's what we learn whenever we look at it. Somebody's left out of that number for whatever reason. Now, some people will say it's Dinah because she was a woman. It wasn't uncommon to leave, when you're counting descendants, to leave the females out. There's also a guy in there that says something pretty unique about that it doesn't say about anybody else. That's Shaul. And what's said about Shaul there? Did you catch that? I'll have to look what verse. I don't even remember. Anybody find it? Go ahead. Let's see here. Verse 10. Shaul, the son of a Canaanite woman. Why would they put that? How important was the bloodline? Pretty important, wasn't it? So could it be that this guy is left out of the total number? Yeah, it could be. Could it be that Dinah's left out of there? Yeah, it could be. All I can tell you is one of them's left out of there for some reason. Doesn't really tell us why. But when they started thinking about lineage, one of those people were left out. So what we learn is, if we're looking at this list, and you're thinking about, well, how many descendants of Leah went down into Egypt? The first thing you got to do is you got to add one to the list, because there's one in there that's not counted. So you really have 34 instead of 33. Now, you ask yourself this question: is there anybody you have to subtract from the list of Leah? The two dead guys, right? The two guys that didn't go down into the land of Egypt, right? So you got all these people who did, 34 that are mentioned there, but two of them didn't. And so how do you adjust that number? Well, the easy thing is you take 34 and subtract 2, and you got 32. So 32 of Leah's descendants went down into Egypt whenever Jacob made that journey. 2 of them did not. That was and Onan. So if you think about, again, how do I adjust these numbers? And of course, that's mentioned Genesis 46:12 there. And Onan died in the land of Canaan. So we know we have to subtract 2 from that. Then the number you're going to come up with is 32 for Leah. Jacob's descendants through Leah, those who came out of his loin, were part of his family that dealt with Leah, were 32 in number. So now you go back to these numbers you're reading about, and you look through these women and their descendants, and you start asking yourself, well, are there any other numbers that you got to adjust or account for? And so we said Leah's has to be adjusted down to 32, right? You got to add Dinah in there first, get 34. Then you got to take and Onan off the list, you get 32. Again, I'm going to repeat this a lot, but like I said, that's part of learning. Unfortunately, you have to listen to repetitive things to learn them over and over again. But you look at Zilpah's 16 and you look through there and say, there's nobody that you can say in that list didn't go down into Egypt. And so I would say, yeah, it's a pretty solid list. You look at Bilhah's 7 that are mentioned there and you say, well, okay, yeah, that makes sense. That's a pretty solid list there too. And the only other one that leaves us with, the only other list that you can look at and say, we got to adjust these numbers a little bit, is Rachel's. So why do we need to adjust Rachel's numbers? Who were Rachel's sons? Yeah, Joseph and Benjamin, right? So what do we learn in verse 20 there of Genesis 46? Joseph had 2 sons, right? He had those two sons when? In Egypt. Not in Canaan. But notice Genesis 46:26 again. Notice the language here. These are the souls that came with Jacob. Okay, so ask yourself this question. Who is it, as you read through the list of Rachel, who is it in this list that didn't come with Jacob into Egypt? Well, yeah, is there anybody else?
Probably had wives.
Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but that's true, yeah. Joseph himself. Did Joseph come with Jacob whenever he came into Egypt? He was already in Egypt, wasn't he? Did Ephraim come with Jacob whenever he went into Egypt? No, he was already in Egypt. Did Manasseh come with Jacob whenever he journeyed to Egypt? No, he was already there. And you might think, well, that's kind of a stretch, but it's not, because notice what the Bible tells us in Exodus 1:1-5. I want you to look at this again. These are the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt. Who are their names? Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. What does verse 5 say about Joseph? Joseph was already in Egypt. Did he come into Egypt with Jacob? No. Joseph and his family were already in Egypt before Jacob ever got there. And so you kind of look at Rachel's list and you say, well, there's 14 people that are mentioned here, but we know that 3 of them didn't come with Jacob, right? When he made that journey to Egypt. Because Exodus 1:5 tells us they were already there. They were already in Egypt. And so here's what happens. If you take those numbers of Leah's, you count them all up, you got 34 descendants that are listed there. Okay, you subtract those 2 guys who didn't come into Egypt, you're left with 32. And then you add to that Zilpah's 16. Somebody good at math? 48. Add to that Bilhah's 7. 55. And then Rachel was listed as 14, but you got to take 3 off because 3 were already there. That leaves us with 11. What does that make, Robbie? 66 people. 66 souls that came with Jacob into Egypt. So what's happening here is the first one is telling us in totality, from all the family of Jacob, there were 70 people who ended up in Egypt. But how many actually traveled into Egypt with Jacob?
66.
Well, only 66, right? Now notice this again. This is important because that preposition with is kind of the key to understanding a lot of these things that we're talking about here tonight. So the entire family of Jacob that came into Egypt numbered 7. So we've got 66. How do you get 7? No, 2 dead ones didn't make it. Of all the family of Jacob, 70 of them end up in Egypt.
Add Joseph and 2 boys and 9.
Okay, we got to add Joseph and the 2 boys back. Where does that get us? 69. We didn't add Jacob yet, did we? You add Jacob into the mix and you got 70, right? You know, if somebody were to ask me how many people are in your family, immediate family, I would say there's 5. Would I count myself? Well, sure, I'm part of my family, aren't I? When you talk about all the total number of Jacob's family that ends up in Egypt is 70, do you have to count him too? Yeah, he's part of that equation. And so one of those verses is talking about the number of people that went with Jacob into Egypt from his family. And the other one is talking about the total number of Jacob's family that winds up in Egypt itself. So, does that make sense? Some people say yes, some people are undecided. Well, we're just touching the tip of the iceberg now, right? Because when we get over into the New Testament, we've been studying Stephen on Sunday mornings in Acts chapter 7. But when he starts talking about Joseph calling his father and all his family or all of his relatives to him, how many people does he say went down into Egypt? 75. Well, now what in the world are we talking about, right? Because one back here in the Old Testament, you got these 66. We figured out that's just the descendants of Jacob that came with him. We already had 3 living in there, didn't count Jacob himself. That makes the 70, the total of all that end up. So how do we explain the 75? Anybody do any studying on it?
Count the sons, grandsons, sons, grandsons.
Okay.
That's
Yeah. This is kind of interesting to me because when you go back through the Hebrew Old Testament, you'll never come across in any of the Hebrew manuscripts, you'll never come across the 75 number. And so you look at that, again, a lot of times it said Genesis, you'll get the 70, Exodus 70, Deuteronomy 70. That's pretty consistent throughout the Hebrew Old Testament. But you kind of stop and you think, were there any versions or any translations that they used back then that included the number 75? Anybody study that any?
Septuagint is that they also had 9 members of Joseph's family.
Yeah. So what was the Septuagint? Just to kind of get us all up to speed here.
First 5 books of the Old Testament. It was the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament.
There you go. It was the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, a little bit of Aramaic, but mostly Hebrew. And the common language of the day and age during Stephen and during the days of Jesus was what?
Greek.
Yeah, Greek. And so what do you do to a person who wants to read the Old Testament who can't read Hebrew or Aramaic? You translate it into Greek, don't you? That was the Septuagint. That was the Greek translation of the Hebrew and Aramaic Old Testament. Was it widely used in the days of Jesus? Well, interesting tidbit, but if you open up the New Testament and you read whenever Jesus enters into his own country of Nazareth and he goes into the synagogue and he opens up the scroll and he reads from the book of Isaiah, guess which translations he's reading from? It's the Septuagint. You know how you know that? Go back and look at Isaiah in our Hebrew translated Bibles. And you'll say, that's not the same. Go ahead.
Do you know, I don't know, do you know when that was translated into Greek approximately?
I do not.
250 BC.
All right. We got a winner back here. 250 years before Jesus. So it was used widely throughout that area at that particular time. So it wasn't uncommon for people to read from the Septuagint. Here's what's interesting, though. If you go back, I have to fast forward here because I'm running out of time. If you go back to Genesis 46:27 in the Septuagint, okay, this isn't in our English translated from the original tongue, the Bible. This is from the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And you know what it reads in Genesis 46:27? It says, the sons of Joseph who were with him in Egypt were 9 souls. All the souls of the house of Jacob which came with Jacob into Egypt were 75 souls. Isn't that interesting? Who was it that mentioned that the change? Notice when we read about Joseph in our versions and translations, we only read about 3 of his descendants, right? Himself and Manasseh and Ephraim. The Septuagint actually adds the children of Manasseh and Ephraim into the lineage of Joseph. And so that's how they came up with the number 75. You add the children or Joseph's grandchildren in that equation, you'll come up with 75 souls. But it's kind of interesting just to point out, if Stephen was quoting from the Septuagint, did he quote correctly? Well, sure he did. That's what the Septuagint said. And what's interesting is there's no Jew that stands up there and says, wait a minute, Stephen, you're wrong. There weren't 75, there were only 70. Right? because that was the widely used translation of that day and age. Stephen his main point wasn't how many people went down in the land of Egypt. You know, we do that a lot today. We'll read about things in our Bible that are inaccurate, but I don't go back and try to correct them because I'm not trying to make a point about it. If I were, I'd probably go back and talk about it a little bit.
What about the timeline for the grandkids and the great-grandkids?
Yeah, so there's probably some substituting that went on there, don't you think? How deeply did you go down that hole?
Well, if you're gonna say when did they go down there, these children are gonna be 9 years old or less.
Yeah, well, some of the brothers would have been in their
I'm
50s.
saying, Joseph's 2 sons,
Yeah,
would they be 9 years old or less?
yeah. So that makes the 75 a little bit harder, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking this number was written after the fact, and they just added all these people in, if it was written.
And that was,
years later.
yeah, that was pretty common when the Septuagint was translated, to take a lot of the notes that had been made and kind of add those into the passage itself to add clarity. So, that's one of the possibilities. We're about out of time, but I'll mention, if you don't like that, I've had some people say, don't talk to me about other versions or translations, Well, there's other ways you can explain it too. One of the things that we read about, it's kind of interesting, but you read about the daughters, plural, and granddaughters, plural, of Jacob in his lineage. How many daughters do you read or how many names of daughters do you read about in that lineage? Only one daughter and only one granddaughter. Could there have been more women who weren't included in the genealogy list? Well, yeah, it's pretty common in that day and age to leave women out. Think about this. If I ask you, how many children and grandchildren do you have? And you say, well, I've got 70. And I say, how many are female? You say, well, 2. Does that make much sense? I mean, what are the odds of that? So there was probably some other daughters and granddaughters who didn't make the official number or list, so to speak. This is another interesting tidbit too, and I would lean toward the Septuagint, but this is I think would be number 2 on my list here. You do learn in Genesis 46:26 that there is an exclusion in this list. And you know who's excluded in the list? The wives of the sons of Jacob. So we know their wives went down into Egypt too, but they aren't included in that number. A lot of times in the Bible, you read about a number, it's only males, right? Not including women and children is something it'll say like that. But the interesting thing is, if you take those 66 people that came along with Jacob, and you add Jacob to it, that's 67. That only leaves you 8 wives that could come. And that there were 11 brothers there that were left, right? So what does that tell you? Well, somebody had to be a widow, didn't they? You think of anybody of those sons who was a widower? Judah. Genesis 38:12. You read about him. His wife dies before they make it down into Egypt. You also read about Reuben sleeping with Jacob's concubine. You think his wife was still alive when he did that? I'd hope not. It's probably not, which would explain it a little bit more. Is it possible that, 3 of these wives had died? Yeah, it's possible. I mean, you got one for sure. Probably another one, and all you'd need is one more included in it, and that would make 8 wives that came along, and you put them together with all the others, you got 75 people. So the main thing to take home from this is it's not something you can't explain. Okay, there's plenty of explanations, there's plenty of possibilities. That's what we really need to take home. And again, I hope it made some sense. You may not have understood all of it that we talked about, but I hope it made some sense. And if you'll look at that outline that I handed out, I think that will help you study and go along. All right, I did all the talking or most of it. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments or questions?
You said Jesus, the Septuagint that he quoted from Isaiah, did you say?
Yeah.
What
from Isaiah, do you remember what?
Well, it's when the blind were healed, the captive were set free. I don't know the exact chapter. Is it 63? No, 61 maybe. Got to be right there in the 60s somewhere. But yeah, look it up and then read it from your Old Testament and see how it reads, see if it's a different. Anybody else?
He quoted a lot from the St. Luke.
Yeah.
Not all of the St. Luke is there.
No. No.
For me, my New Testament has a flat out statement. I'll need to understand before I say.
Well, and again, it was the common language of that day and age. I mean, you want the common person to be able to read the Bible in his own language. And that was the translation they had. Was it perfect? No.
Plus, Stephen went back and forth, was full of the Holy Ghost.
Yeah.
There's no way he could make a mistake.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point. Anybody else?